Hello students and welcome to video 1.3 on perspectives in psychology. This corresponds to your book section 1.4. Today we'll be giving an overview of the 8 major perspectives in psychology, those being the psychodynamic perspective, behavioral, humanistic, cognitive, sociocultural, biological, biopsychosocial, and the evolutionary perspective. Starting with the psychodynamic perspective, we have that coming from the theories posed by Sigmund Freud. These are returning to the major ideas of the unconscious and how that affects our conscious behavior. Since Freud's passing, they have moved away from his original ideas, finding them not to be scientific enough, and more focusing on developing a sense of self, interpersonal relationships, and motivations behind people's behaviors, and less on his original focus on sex and sexual drives, but still keeping that focus on the unconscious and how it manifests in our conscious behavior. Following the development of the psychodynamic perspective was the behavioral perspective, initiated by John B. Watson and this man, B.F. Skinner. This perspective was based off the belief that psychology should study only observable behavior and that all of our behavior is influenced by learned association through a process called conditioning. An example of conditioning would be Pavlov's dog or this. When you go to a grocery store and see a screaming child and a tired parent, when the parent eventually gives up and decides to give them the candy or the sweets or whatever they want, the child has now learned that whenever he wants something, if he screams and cries about it, he is more likely to get it. Again, behaviorism is focused on how we learn observable responses, especially at its inception. It felt like if we couldn't directly observe it, we had no business studying it. These two perspectives are the oldest, most influential, and longest running perspectives, starting from near psychology's inception and lasting until today. These next perspectives are all more recent, popping up in the last 50 years or so, starting in the 1960s. The first of these perspectives is the humanistic perspective, and it came out of the idea that as opposed to being just observable learned responses, humans have free will and should be able to pursue their own interests. Their ultimate goal was to be self-actualized or reach their fullest potential. And here you find what's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. He theorized that in order to be self-actualized, you needed to hit certain markers or have certain needs met. So, for example, the things on the bottom of the pyramid are significantly more important than the top. If you haven't gotten one of those bottom needs, you can't move on. For instance, if you come to school without eating breakfast, you're going to be focused on finding something to eat or how hungry you are. Therefore, you won't really care what your teachers are teaching about because you're focused on that physiological need of food. Again, the focus of the humanistic perspective is how we have our needs met and how we progress through this hierarchy of needs to one day eventually reaching our fullest potential and becoming self-actualized. The perspective following the humanists was the cognitive perspective. And this came up right around the time computers were being developed because they noticed how similarly computers simulated human thought. So the cognitive perspective is focused on how we encode, process, store, and retrieve information. Much how like you can save a document on a computer, type in it, close it, and then open it up later. Here we see a return to some of the Gestalt theories of studying the whole as opposed to one of its parts. because you can't really study something by just looking at a single aspect of it. You have to study it in the whole. So this is really focused on kind of mental skills and how they relate to everyday life. Some of the focuses of the cognitive perspective are intelligence, learning, perception, thought processes, problem solving, and language. Really focusing on how our interpretations and how the ongoing mental processes affect our experiences and how those mental processes affect how we interact with the world. Another perspective is the socio-cultural perspective. This mixes two aspects of psychology, being social psychology, the study of how groups, social roles, and relationships affect how we interact with each other, and cultural psychology, studying culture norms and culture expectations. This is focusing on how we move and interact through our world, because as you'll often notice, you will act much differently around your friends than you will your family, but also on how we interact with the world around us, because we may all know that a smile is universal, but if you were to go to a different country and flip somebody the middle finger, they would have no idea what that means. So it's the study of how our social norms and how our cultural norms interact in day-to-day life. So again, it really focuses on how behavior and thinking vary across different social situations and different cultures. The biological perspective is entirely focused on the brain's interaction with the body. Specifically, it's focused on how the brain and body enable emotions, memory, and sensory experiences, and how genes combine with the environment to influence individual differences. So frequently, psychologists will do things like twin studies to see to what degree something is left up to genetics and to what degree it's left up to the environment. For example, through many years of testing, we've found that intelligence is something that's about 50% decided by your genetics and 50% decided by your environment. The biopsychosocial perspective looks at how your biology, your psychology, and your social cultural influence are all connected, and how they all come together to form a picture of your mental health. For example, if you suddenly go through a traumatic event in your family or personal life, that can have psychological consequences such as intense grief and or depression, and you can try to cope with those by abusing certain substances like drugs or alcohol. And if you are predisposed biologically to an addiction, then it is more likely you will become dependent on that substance. And that predisposition to addiction can also lead to more social consequences, like alienating yourself from your support network, feeding into those further psychological issues, and continuing in an aggressive cycle. It really looks at how these three factors interact with each other to affect mental health. Lastly, evolutionary psychology takes the theories of Charles Darwin and natural selection and tries to apply them to human behavior, and tries to study how the behavioral traits, and genes of people have progressed through the ages, just as how physical traits for animals, like a longer neck for giraffes, have been passed down through natural selection. Certain traits, behaviors, and mental processes and genes have been passed down evolutionarily in a psychological process. So it's taking the theories of natural selection and focusing them on psychological and behavioral aspects. We'll be sure to study all of these perspectives more in depth as the course progresses, but these is just a general overview of what these things are about. So, for one more time, the focus of the psychodynamic approach is how behavior springs from subconscious drives and conflicts. Behaviorism tries to focus on how we learn and use observable responses. The humanistic approach focuses on how we address certain needs, but for things like food, love, shelter, and acceptance, and how we progress to achieving self-fulfillment. The cognitive perspective is how we encode, process, store, and retrieve information. The social cultural is how behavior and thinking varies across different situations and how it varies across different cultures and how those interact with each other. The biological, how the body and brain enable emotions, memories, sensory experiences, and how genes combine with the environment to influence individual differences. The biopsychosocial, focusing on how biology, psychology, and sociocultural influences come together to affect our mental health. And the evolutionary perspective, taking natural selection of traits and how that has promoted the survival of certain genes.